As ECOWAS works tirelessly, led by Ghanaian President John Dramani Mahama, to bring Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger back into the fold, another shift is underway. Togo has now reaffirmed its plans to join the alliance of Sahel states AES, signaling a potential expansion of the bloc and raising questions about the future of regional unity. Is this the beginning of a deeper geopolitical divide, or could diplomacy still bridge the gap of what's happening within the West African sub-region? Today we break down the implications of this power play for West Africa's stability, security and economic future with our guests this day. Welcome to Talking Point. Let's dive in. Hello, fervent televiewers and fervent listeners. It's always a pleasure to be in your company over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. But today we dive into West Africa with the latest developments, where another West African country have shown interest in wanting to join the alliance of Sahel state, notably Togo, the second time already in 2025. And of course, we shall be analyzing this, especially with the shifts away from the regional bloc, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. So to implicate, or better still, to discuss this latest development this day, I'm being joined by Dr. Eddie Eric in his capacity as a global politics consultant, the Executive Secretary of Committees of Action for Côte d'Ivoire. Thank you immensely, sir, for joining us.
Always, Sharon, my pleasure to be with you.
It's always a pleasure to have you discuss African matters and other matters affecting equally the African continent. Meanwhile, to kickstart today's conversation, we remind our audience that we had a similar conversation like this a while ago, and of course it was on how these three countries that had exited the regional bloc, if they would finally come back, when the Ghanaian President John Dramani Mahama made a visit to the three West African countries, including Ivory Coast. Now, away from that, now we're looking at the latest developments a few days afterwards. Aside from economic gains, which was a point you had brought forth the last time, what are the key motivations behind Togo's decision to wanting to join the alliance of Sahel states?
Sharon, I believe that, from what we are reading, there is a conglomerate of factors, reasons that militate and explain why Togo is expressing, what is interested in there. Of course, the first one that we should not shy away from is the economic reasons, especially when we look at the maritime trades. Let us remember that Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger are landlocked countries that have relied on the coastal countries of Togo, Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana for their, even Senegal to a certain extent, for their maritime trades, which of course, remain very, very important. That's the first reason. By deciding to join this alliance of Sahel states, there is a clear economic gains to be made in there. But let us also not forget that what those countries share borders. Togo and Burkina Faso share borders. Ghana and all these countries, there is a way. You have the interpenetration of people. When we look again, at the cross-border trades that go on in there, this is one factor also to account or to reckon with. In terms of security, we know that not long ago there have been, even without a clearly established military cooperation, there were some joint military operations between that took place involving troops from Togo and troops from the countries of the Sahel states. This is because what is going on in the Sahel, the terrorist, attacks that we talk about, which of course has have ended up, occupying large swath of territories in those countries that are mostly affected, are not just, were contained in there. We have seen, violence, attacks in countries, in the coastal countries. Again, Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana have their share of terrorist attacks on their soil. And another reason, so therefore, to bolster security is another factor. Another reason that we should also take into consideration here is that Togo has not announced its departure from the ECOWAS, right? Exactly. Clearly understood that, joining the alliance of Sahelian state, when it becomes effective, and if it is effective, will definitely mark some shift in there. However, the last time we met it in here, I did say that at some point I don't see any contradiction. The alliance of Sahel states will continue to evolve as President John Mahama during his trip over there to Mali and asserted the relevance of that union, but at the same time it can coexist with any other organization. However, and I'm ending on that, Togo knocking at the door of the AES definitely signals, another geopolitical change in the region.
Another geopolitical change indeed. But then let's move forward. I'm glad you mentioned that there are other blocks or other groups that do exist, within the regional bloc ECOWAS. But with that said, we had earlier on signaled that this withdrawal from ECOWAS could signal some sort of turning point within the region. But then, from your perspective, what are some of the prospects for coexistence between AES and ECOWAS?
Looking at it's a matter of a power of a balance of power. I want to say in there. My first analysis is that the countries of the Sahel that join hands within the AES, that move was a clever one, regardless of what people may say, especially using this whole and constant attitude of disregarding the ability of African politicians, African leaders, to be savvy and play by the rules of what we know as international politics. I will say that it is a clear, or it was a clear, realistic, move being made in there, in terms of preserving their integrity, preserving their territories, preserving their national identities, preserving the national interests, and creating an alliance that becomes a balance, of power with the other states of the alliance. There is something that but we always say, even small countries, right, in the political or global political arena, do have their diplomacies, do have their tools by which they assert what their national interests in the global stage, which become what we know as foreign policy. So that's number one. Number two, therefore, the prospect of this coexistence, honestly, again, do not see some contradictions. Why? The ECOWAS is a multilateral alliance. But that multilateral alliance, regardless of the sanctions that have been imposed, and then the relationships between the different countries, let's say between Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso and Mali, have been strained lately because of these political jabs, was sent from one end to the other, and from the other end to the first one in terms of the political rhetoric. I want to talk about that. The ways in which the leaders in Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, before Johnny Mahama, criticized, vehemently the leadership in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, and even Chad, as being under military rule. This kind of put a damp on the relationship between. However, those countries have not announced that they were completely severing ties. They have not announced that they are rupturing any diplomatic relation, any economic or bilateral relations. I do not remember, for instance, the Ivory Coast, were deciding to expel the ambassadors of these three countries out, even though at some point there have been ambassadors being recalled, for consultations and things like that. So using that, and then using also another factor that I mentioned last time when we had a conversation on the situation in West Africa, looking at the fact that the ECOWAS has a larger political, economic, and even the security institutions in the region have coexisted with some other multilateral or bilateral, organizations. I did mention the Conseil de l'Entente. I did mention the Mano River Union, which includes Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. I did mention even at the economic level the West African Economic and Monetary Union that exists within that space of the ECOWAS. And based on that, I see the prospects of coexistence between the AES and the ECOWAS, moving forward. At the same time, also, I hope that the current move by the AES countries, based on the factors, the reasons why they moved away from the ECOWAS, the reasons why they formed that alliance, will and may end up triggering something. Why? I believe that what we have seen, right, these countries, were getting closer, for instance, to other superpowers. And here I want to clearly name Russia, and also increasing their interest in the BRICS countries. This is another geopolitical change in India. In addition to many other decisions that are being made internally, I believe that, I see the possibility of this coexistence in positive light, especially that the entire African continent is working on a continental free agreement, which in itself also has not eliminated any kind of a regional multilateral agreement or bilateral agreement that exists between countries. So I see that being possible if only the African leaders are capable of putting aside egos, putting aside the influence that they have been subjected to from external powers, and putting the interests of their country, the interests of their people first.
Exactly, it's always about putting the interest of the people first. And now moving forward, since we're discussing, the implications of this division that's happening within West Africa. Now, how does this impact, these latest developments impact, the ongoing mediation efforts that was initiated by the Ghanaian president, which we saw just recently?
It add another layer. I believe it will add another layer of another hurdle, right, to clear. But at the same time also, it may be another catalyst, toward, resolving the matter if many more countries, right, are softening, changing actually their positions when it comes to how the countries of the Sahel were dealt with in 2022 and 2023 when these military regimes took over, and especially when they did not communicate the clear timetables for to hold what people will call elections. Mm-hmm. So I actually do see that as a hurdle, but at the same time, it is a hurdle that can be easily bypassed. Let us not forget that Togo was deeply involved in a number of negotiations between the countries of the Sahel and the leaders of the coastal countries. Remember, there was a standout between Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso over the 49 soldiers from Ivory Coast who were captured and arrested in Burkina Faso, accused of attempting to overthrow the government in there. It is Togo that led the mediation to its successful accomplishment. So I think those elements, are weighing a lot, in the ways in which Togo today is approaching those countries. And let us not forget that, each of those countries, at the end of the day, are also eyeing their own economic and political developments. And these are three big countries, big in terms of their territories, small probably in terms of the GDPs. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger represent a good market. And this also should not be taken, away from the table when we are analyzing the reasons why Togo is interested, even why Ghana also has a softened, with that position. The port of Tema in the port of Ghana, the port of Togo or Lomé, I will say, side by side, because these two countries are neighboring countries. And from there to Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, we are looking at something of the same distance. So there is also an undertone of competition that I see there as well. But at the end of the day, we need to look at what the economic, political sanctions imposed on the countries of the AES, the rhetoric, the political discourse that was developed at the time between 2022 and 2023, what have been the outcomes? Did they yield the kind of the pressure? Did that yield the kind of outcome that those leaders were expecting? The answer to that question is clearly no. We remember that President Tinubu of Nigeria did threaten at one point to send a military force in Niger to restore the regime of Mohamed Bazoum, of forcing the military out. Those threats did not, make those regimes in Niger budge, which means that they did not yield what they were supposed to be yielding. So before this failure, there is clearly a need to readjust and set, a new path, a new way of resolving those conflicts in such a way that, the regional organizations, whichever they are, remain strong and viable organizations.
And of course, organizations that could, assist Africans in attaining the objectives of a prosperous continent. And now, during an interview granted to 4U Media Africa, the Bissau-Guinean president stated that the regional bloc ECOWAS needed some sort of internal reforms. I'll pick up from that statement now to further with my question. Could Togo's shift towards AES actually signal some sign of ECOWAS, losing influence within the region?
ECOWAS has already lost influence in the region.
Absolutely.
Already and clearly, right? Even the latest thing that we see probably may add on to that, but the ways in which the ECOWAS have not been able to again implement, infuse, or bring about or trigger the changes that they wanted to see in those three countries. Those things, kind of polarized the political atmosphere in West Africa in the past 2 years. This is already a weakening position of a regional institution, the largest in Africa, that has not been able to make the leaders in Burkina Faso, in Ghana, in Mali, and Niger, especially these three, flinch. Even in Guinea, Conakry, flinch. Those military rules are in place. The ECOWAS has nothing to do with Chad, of course, but we also see that, sometimes there is some sort of impacts, when one regional bloc makes a decision and does something that is very successful, it can also trigger some sort of a same reaction in another regional economic, community. So the ECOWAS is already weakened. Another reason why we believe the ECOWAS, has weakened a lot is, again, the reaction of the people themselves. How many of the citizens in West Africa do not believe, right, in the power of this institution to actually enforce its own protocols on democracy, protocols on security, protocols on security, and even on the economy. Let's look at the protocols on democracy and peaceful elections, for instance. How many of those even civilian leaders in the West Africa area have manipulated the constitutions in their countries to remain in power? The prime example is the one in Côte d'Ivoire. Another example is what happened in Senegal. And another example is what is currently happening in Guinea-Bissau, which has led to this the statement made by the head of state of that country, Mbalo Sissoko. I believe that his position is very hypocritical, because he was part of the leaders in West Africa and within the ECOWAS that were quick to impose sanctions on Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger because of these military coups in India. But what he is doing himself will be akin of what? Constitutional violation. So Sharon, this kind of hypocrisy, this double or multiple standards that the ECOWAS has shown and demonstrated throughout the years is also one of the reasons, or one of the factors, that weakened the institution and took away its credibility. After all these major successes that we have witnessed in the early 1990s with the intervention in Sierra Leone, intervention in Liberia, for instance, there are many other things that the ECOWAS have not been able to do, which of course, led to the inability of this institution itself to help with the situation in Benin, in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger regarding the terrorist group that were in India. The leaders of those countries, the military leaders, quite often, Ibrahim Traoré, who have very often heard saying that the level of compassion demonstrated by these leaders of the ECOWAS was close to zero compared to the level of compassion they demonstrated anytime there was some terrorist, attack in, let's say, in France, for instance.
Exactly, and that is the latest development. But regards Guinea-Bissau, remember the president had just gone through one tenure and is expected maybe to get 4 another, which is the second. But we're not discussing Guinea-Bissau. Now, looking at the table on the topic on deck today, with the AES expanding, which we have highlighted is going to result in some sort of shift, but does this create some, further risk of a permanent geopolitical divide, especially within West Africa? Because you mentioned in one of your responses that these countries are gradually improving their closeness with global powers like Russia, China, and other countries at the global level, including, their participation within key institutions or key organizations, blocks like the BRICS. So how does this signal a further risk of geopolitical divide within the sub-region?
Well, this is what we are seeing and witnessing. We know that little by little, many African countries have inched, toward and increased their relationship with other powers, away from the European powers. One prime example is Nigeria. Nigeria joined the BRICS countries not long ago, without severing ties with Europe or North American countries.
Exactly.
We also know, this is not West Africa, but we can take the example of South Africa, for instance. And we remember clearly how President Cyril Ramaphosa told, leaders, of the world that, nobody should be dictating the type of relationship that, his country, South Africa, should be having with other powers in the world. All in all, what we are also seeing with the type of populations that we have today in Africa, in majority young people, with the technological revolution that are also pumping in Africa today, and with this massive circulation of information left and right, there is a new awakening, right, of the question of sovereignty, around the question of sovereignty in most of the African countries, and especially in the West African countries. When you see in the interview here the young people that are in support of what is happening in their countries, right? It is not because these people are applauding, a military or dictatorship. They are actually looking for ways to have to live in the country, or to live in countries where job opportunities, right, opportunities to live a decent life exist, and that's where the hope is. Therefore, to come back to your question more clearly, we are witnessing again, some major changes. Where is that going to lead us? Of course, day by day, we see things. For the long time, we know that Mali has been able to regain some swath of their territories because of the support they receive from other non-Western European, powers. Is it going to stay as is? The answer to the question may be yes, it may be no. But at the same time, at the economic level, we saw that countries such as China have increased their role, right, in the economy. Chinese-owned or Chinese-operated, companies have expanded their presence. We see that, some countries have also built new relationship or expanded their relationship with countries such as Turkey. We've seen even some Asian-based, countries, Saudi Arabia, for instance, and other powers, the United Emirates, Arab Emirates, for instance, also increasing their relationship with those countries. All of those elements, I believe, will be playing into what you call these major geopolitical changes that will be taking place in India. Absolutely. Not to talk about, today the race to what we call the critical minerals, right? What we should be worried of is how the race to diamonds, years ago to gold, which clearly was linked to the situation in Sierra Leone, the war in Sierra Leone, how the race to this critical mineral in West Africa today may or may not trigger other forms of a civilian or conflict that will degenerate into civilian conflict, and of course, will maim the lives of numerous peoples. But yes, we are witnessing something. We are seeing some changes. We are seeing the disintegration or maybe reorganization of the West Africa regional bloc in and there, which may, we hope, lead to strengthening it instead of continuously weakening it.
Exactly, and of course, speaking of this power shift, which we're seeing within the West African sub-region, Dr. Eddie, do you believe that these might, affect the region in terms of security? Because we recall that the shifts that these countries had when, the leaders in the three West African countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, when they took over power, in terms of resolving the security crisis that was in that part of the Sahel, they have been able to quell insecurity as of now, as opposed to when they had French troops within the soil. So looking at this, how might this power shift impact regional security, especially in the fight against terrorism and the numerous insurgencies which we have seen not just within these three countries but within the Sahel as a whole?
The hope, I will start with this, the hope is to see a more stable, secure West Africa region to begin with, and a more secure African, continent, as a whole. It is true that, there have been some improvements based on the new forms of alliances that those countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, built with some other superpowers to acquire the weaponry and the logistics actually that they need. There is no military without, that logistics, without the weaponry, without those arms, those weapons that are sophisticated enough, and also in the hands of the right army, controlled by the right army to quell, as you said, what we see. So there's been some improvement, very definitely, but there's still a lot to do, and a lot to do to regain total control of those territories. And it means what it means. In addition to regaining control of those territories, populations have to be relocated back to their areas of existence, which means that, people who were farmers have to go back to regain their lands so that, families can continue to live off of agriculture. There's schools that needs to reopen so that, children will receive their education in those places that they have to flee because of the violence. And this is what all that means. Security may definitely improving in there, but the glue to all of those things again will be the ability for the West African countries in general and as a whole, either individually but also collectively, to build and develop their, what I call their fire capacity. If we are witnessing, or what we are seeing in those countries today is also closely or related to the inability or the weakness of our African armies or West African armies. Not just in terms of the ways in which the troops are trained, but the equipment that they possess, and what they have and what they do not have. Listen, we live in a world in which deterrence matters. And in order to deter any attack against the soil, in order to deter any attack against the sovereignty of a nation, there are some tools that are being used, or they say tools that we necessitate are necessary. Those tools include clearly weapons. So until those armies and those countries really build strong forces to kind of push back against the kind of things, and it can be done either individually or by building strong alliances and having joint operations, for instance, as we saw not long ago, and I did mention that between Togo and the countries of the Sahel, for instance. So security will matter. I see some possibility of it being improved, but the glue again to it, and I'm landing on that, is the ability of those African countries to really assert their sovereignty vis-a-vis their military, meaning building strong military capacities to push back or resist any kind of attack against their territories.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Reddy. Now, moving forward, we have acknowledged the fact that there are economic as well as political ramifications to this split, and of course the expansion or possible expansion of the AES. But you equally mentioned that this expansion could equally result in, a split in trade or regional integration within the West African sub-region. Now, how might this ECOWAS and AES countries, navigate moving forward future diplomatic as well as economic relations?
Well, all of those things, maybe naively, I want to say that it's a matter of signature, right? And the ecosystem, right? The trade ecosystem, the diplomatic ecosystem, the big population, the cross-border ecosystem in there also already recommend that, or make it easy, let me put it this way, for these, the ECOWAS and the emerging AES, bloc to cooperate. So let me decipher all that. The regional integration in terms of trades is a must for the West African countries and for the countries of Africa in general. Not long ago, the ministers of commerce, trade, and economy of Africa met in Addis Ababa. Actually, this last week, for the Council of Ministers, were over the Continental Free Trade Agreements, its implementation and its continuation, because the African countries, the leaders of these African countries understand that creating these common markets, right, for the entire continent is a way to go to strengthen their economies and also to kind of increase the volume of trade that they have among themselves. That template is at the continental level, but is also at the regional level. When you look at the population in Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, where we see that between 26 and 40% of the population is made up of natives from neighboring countries, Burkina Faso and Mali. I do remember that, in 2006 or 22, when 2002, when he was in power, the late president of Mali, Amadou Toumani Touré, when he visited in Côte d'Ivoire, he landed in Bouaké, which is the second largest city in the Ivory Coast, in the central parts. And he said this, that Bouaké is actually the second capital of Mali after Bamako. The reason why he says it is because outside of Mali, the largest population of Malians are found in Bouaké. When you hear that, number one, you automatically want to think about the weight of this population when it comes to Mali's economy, when it comes to Mali's GDP, when it comes to remittances, and to what extent this population is contributing, right, to the GDP, the national revenue of the country. When we talk about remittances that, what people in the diaspora send to their country, it's not just those who live in the European countries. We are talking about immigrants or migrant workers who are everywhere in the world. So if you have these large populations from Mali and Burkina Faso living, let's say, in a country such as, Côte d'Ivoire, and we should not also forget that Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana are two countries that produce the largest amount of cocoa beans in the world.
True.
These cocoa farms are actually markets or labor markets, sectors of employment for workers, sometimes poorly employed, right, poorly paid, working under strenuous conditions. This is a topic that we can talk about, next time, including even violation of labor rights and all of those things. But those workers also sometimes do descend from the landlocked countries. Because of that, I believe that there is an obligation for the countries of the coasts who remain within the ECOWAS to technically sit and find ways to harmonize the trade relations with the countries of the AES. It is a must. Second reason, the economic sanctions imposed on the three countries, the three landlocked countries, because of the military coups there, those economic sanctions ended up hurting the countries that impose them or agree with them also. In terms of what? Goods such as onions, tomatoes, and let us also not forget that there is a cross-border trade that is very important for the populations. And again, I'm looking at the informal labor sectors, where you have many more women. So what have been the implications, the impacts of those sanctions on this? For a long period of time, you remember, the lorries, trucks were blocked at the border between, right, Benin and those countries in there. How many of those are traders? How much do they lose? How much were they compensated for by their own government in the countries that accepted and agreed to impose those economic sanctions? Then you talk about the movement of people. We all agree that today, based on what I said earlier, there is a need, a way to find out how to allow people to circulate. It is easier for goods to circulate, but much more difficult for the people who produce the goods to circulate. Even today, with the ECOWAS passports, which is common to all of the countries, going from Ghana to Cote d'Ivoire is not easy because of the roads being impracticable. Or even if you want to fly, it will be at the cost of your pockets. It is not easy to move around in terms of human beings. These are the things that those countries need to focus on, and I believe that there is a clear way to do that. Last point is the currency. Are the ECOWAS, the AES countries, are they considering leaving the French CFA bloc? If yes, what will be, or there is also another layer, another hurdle that needs to be negotiated in terms of the convertibility of the currency that they will be creating in there. I am in full support of dropping the French CFA currency for all of the African countries, creating a currency that is proper to them, managed by them, instead of a currency that is being managed by another country, France, which is another mechanism of a continued colonialism.
I'll be coming back to your latest reaction, Dr. Eddie, but then let's pick up from here. Now, you spoke about cross-border trade, which benefits the three countries within the sub-region, especially to some extent West Africa. Now, on numerous occasions, we've highlighted the importance of implementing fully the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AFCFTA. Now, could this latest developments we're seeing within West Africa, could this divide, affect the full implementation of these agreements that was signed years back by numerous leaders, which up to date is yet to get into full force? And could this affect, broader economic cooperation within the African continent?
I would say yes, Sharon, because the economic cooperation advanced, implemented by human beings. And at the basis of all that, you have good diplomatic relationships, right, that are needed or important to advance that. There is a saying, and I'm going to paraphrase that, though it's not the best of the best, right? We hear in Western political science literature that, democracies do not fight each other. I'm going to use that example and create another statement in here and say countries that have a good diplomatic relationship, right, automatically also have excellent trade relationship. So the reason why I'm saying this is the implementation of the free continental trade agreement for the entire Africa rests upon good diplomatic neighborhood relationship that the countries should have. It rests on a verge of solidarity. It rests upon the ability to also implement different protocols that they have, even though those protocols are not directly trade matters. If there is a protocol on democracy, which is, for instance, a way to create a very conducive environment for people to thrive, for people's right to be respected, for traders' right to be respected, for workers' right to be respected, for human rights to be respected, but, all of those things, therefore, come into play. Once they are strained, necessarily they can also lead to some complication when it comes to trade relations. Sharon, maybe to repeat ourselves in here, the economic sanctions that were imposed on the other countries, you see, were not different from the verbal or the diplomatic sanctions being imposed on them. There is no way we separate one with another, even though we are talking about trading here, we are talking about, comradeship in here. Those things are all part of those things together. Because again, when we talk about foreign policy, we are talking about, how countries satisfy or meet their national interest at the global level, or at the foreign level, or at the external or international level, whichever word people want to get. So there is some sort of organic relation between all of those things. Again, one example that I will give you, good relationship between Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal, for instance, have led to some sort of tacit agreement when it comes to where the headquarters of certain institutions will be, for instance, hosted. Look, the Central Bank of West Africa is, the main headquarters is in Senegal. But it was a tacit agreement between the leaders of those countries that, okay, if you are hosting, or if you have at the headquarters in your territory, then over here, what we are going to do, then the head of that institution should come from this country. Years ago, there was a company for which my dad worked for, a air company, which was the largest and had the largest, airspace in the world, which was Air Afrique. Air Africa was assigned and enacted by the Treaty of Yaoundé. I believe it was in 1967. Cameroon was part of it, and there were 10 countries. But when they did that, their headquarters was based in Abidjan, but the major points to mechanic shop or to repair all the planes were in Senegal, and the countries have this sort of tacit agreements like that, which again, right, were based on the good relationship that the leaders have one, toward the other. So all of those things are organic, they are good, and they actually do matter for good trade relationship.
Exactly. Now let's pull away from the trade relations that do exist within these countries. I'm going to use an outside example, before getting back to our topic of discussion. Let's take South Africa, for instance. South Africa has been having tensions with the United States, and this has led to, leaders or representatives of the European Union getting closer to the African country, in a bid to choosing different partners or global partners. Now, in the context of what's happening within West Africa, how might global powers, like the European Union, we've seen the anti-French sentiment that has been growing across West Africa, notably in countries, coup-hit countries, that are reeling from coups, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and others within the sub-region. But looking at this, how do these global powers, let's look at the bloc like the European Union, China, Russia, respond to this growing divide that is existing between AES and ECOWAS?
Let me address the countries of Europe. For them, I believe the major things that needs to happen, whether or in their response to the current situation, which they did play into, which they clearly played into. Let us not forget that you mentioned France. France was in Mali, was in Burkina Faso, was also helping intervene in Niger, in Chad, countries where they were clearly asked to leave. Other European powers such as, Sweden, the Netherlands, at some point also did send some troops in there. The European Union, had some sort of a strong say in what happened in there. But moving forward, Sharon, what needs to happen clearly in order to improve, whether it is siding with the countries of the AES or remaining with, keeping their support with the ECOWAS country or the countries that remain within the ECOWAS, the attitude, the paternalistic attitudes that has always guided, informed the European countries' relations with Africa needs to change. This level of neocolonialism needs to change. People are reacting mostly also because of the infantilization of our leaders and our people. When you have a leader such as Macron, before Macron you have Sarkozy, in 2007, who learned somewhere at the university in Dakar to make a speech that reminds us of what Hegel said centuries ago about the fact that for him, the problem with Africa is that Africa has not sufficiently entered in history. Then at the same time, those countries continue to harbor, host, keep objects of art that were stolen from us. Not long ago that France, accepted to return some valuable objects taken during the time of colonization from Benin and other countries, for instance. There are plenty of other objects that remain in there. We continue to see people excavating in Egypt, discovering some mummies that they take away. There are plenty of museums all over Europe that continue to host some artifacts that were taken from those places. But yet, you have some leaders in the 21st century that can boast and say that the problem of Africa is the fact that the continent has not sufficiently entered, history. You can take President Macron, and I'm landing on that one, looking at the situation in Algeria, for instance. Until today, France continues to openly, forcefully, clearly, and fully apologize for what happened during the Algerian Revolution in there. It is only recently, Sharon, that the French government accepted responsibility when it comes to what happened at Camp-Tiaroy, when
Senegal.
French soldiers or troops fired upon and massacred some African troops that were demobilized after they have heroically participated in the Second World War. That was on November 30th, 1944 in Senegal.
Of these latest developments within the West African sub-region, especially in terms of stability. And of course, Dr. Eddy has been shedding more light as far as today's topic of discussion is concerned, highlighting equally that this is going to lead to some sort of reforms within the West African sub-region. We just got indications that Dr. Eddy is back with us. You're welcome back, sir.
Sorry about that, for the cut, this is also technology. But I was ending on the previous question, saying that not long ago, we have also heard a statement by the French president when all those troops were asked to leave. Mr. Macron talked about the ungratefulness of the African countries because they expressed the need. This is the kind of attitude that, what needs to change, number one. Okay? As long as these political thoughts, all those are thoughts, that's a kind of support the ways in which the European countries, will deal with their African counterparts or the African countries, unless these change, unless they see people, as human beings, unless they see them as a people who also have their interests that they need to satisfy. I believe that, regardless of where they side, who they side with, whether it is the ECOWAS or the countries of the Sahel, it is going to be the same attitude and the same reaction. The young people that are crying out today, that are yelling and that are supporting and chanting when the French troops are passing by as they are leaving those countries, they are doing so because, again, of the sheer disrespect that we continue to see in those countries coming from the European powers. So that's what needs to change, regardless of whatever supporter they think they wanted to bring.
Okay, I'll be coming back to you regarding that point, of course. But back to something you mentioned just a while ago, Dr. Eddy, you mentioned that it's imperative for these countries within the sub-region to achieve some sort of economic independence. You spoke about the franc CFA, that if they have to move forward, they need to, look for an alternative. In your perspective, or from your opinion, what is the best alternative of the franc CFA?
I don't know how I want to take this question in terms of best alternative of the franc CFA. Listen, I am again, in support of much or better informed individuals such as Professor Nicolas Agboou or the Togolese former minister Nabukbo and many others who clearly demonstrated that from an economic standpoint, that the French CFA is actually not bringing the kind of, cannot help bring the kind of development we want to see in Africa. But from a political standpoint, as we talk about sovereignty, let's go back to, I'll take an outside, example. There are many other countries in Africa, of course, who that have their own currency. Nigeria has a naira, and other countries have what they have.
Ghana, South Africa, and
Ghana and South Africa, and all of them. Quite often, when we start mentioning that, people who are in support of the status quo will point to the fact that look at the countries such as Côte d'Ivoire, where you have a lot more infrastructures, social, economic infrastructure than other countries where that do not have the currency. But at the same time, also, we are talking about countries that do not qualify as mid-level income countries or semi-developed countries and all that. What I'm trying to say in here, Sharon, is that I am again in full support of moving away, dropping, abandoning the French CFA, because it remains till today one of the mechanisms through which France has maintained its sway over the countries. It is clear that those countries that are using the French CFA, either from West Africa or from East Africa or Central Africa, were former French colonies that needs to move away. There is a possibility. The ECO, for instance, is a currency that West Africa, within the ECOWAS, envisioned to have. Up to now, it has not materialized yet. Effort should be put in that direction. Not long ago, about 2 or 3 years ago, we want to thank the vigilance of President Muhammadu Buhari of Nigeria at the time, because we were that close to have the ECO, the project of the ECO, actually being stolen and transformed into something that was not desirable. It did not move forward, thank God, but the African countries need to move. And I fully support that. I fully support it. Professor Nicolas Bou, for instance, is saying Africa's industrialization is also dependent upon the ability to have their own currency and master their own currency. He clearly explains it's a matter of a signature, per the constitution of each of those countries and the parliament to agree that, hey, today, starting from this point to this point, we are doing this. Do you know that, what the production of these currency notes, bills in French, or the coins and all that, we pay a commission on that. When they're being produced in Chamalier somewhere in France, those African countries pay a commission on that. And all the mechanism that goes with that already, the percentage of the external trade that needs to go to those accounts before they are redistributed and all that, we need to change all those patterns.
And not to forget the reserves.
I strongly support that move, and I will leave the economic aspect of it to the better informed economists, to talk about that. The example that I wanted to mention very quickly, years ago in 76, when the United States started this revolution that led to the country that what we know today, George Washington at the convention in Philadelphia was commissioned to do 2 things. Many things. 2 of them, raise an army, and second, raise a currency. Because you cannot continue, or you cannot. They understood at the time that we cannot fight against the British, British imperialism by continuously relying on the British soldiers. Impossible. And by relying on what? The British currency. Impossible. They understood those 2 things. They are instruments of sovereignty. So I believe that the countries should move away from those things.
The Franc CFA. Okay, now to wrap up the conversation, Dr. Eddie. Now we agree that it's true these 2 groups or 2 blocks can actually coexist, but you see a realistic path of a possible reconciliation, and possibly, if that should happen, what incentives, what compromises could ECOWAS offer, AES countries to make them come back within the bloc? Just in a bit to wrap up today's conversation in some 1 minute 30.
Let me start with this question. Have we seen, maybe 2 years ago, if we were told that the 3 countries, even though we already know that, one country moved away before, right? Mauritania, for instance, withdrew from the ECOWAS, long ago, citing some cultural reasons. We were very far from imagining, actually, that 3 countries, especially 3 small landlocked countries will decide that, they are moving away from the ECOWAS. This is a major change that, many of us, I will say, did not see change. Maybe some did, but I did not see that coming. Why do I say that? I say that to say that, the possibility of those countries coming back to the table
very slim.
Is not off the table. It's not off the table. But what will be more important in here, and will be the incentives, as you said, are satisfying the reasons that led to the splits. One of them is the lack of solidarity. Another one is the failure of the ECOWAS to adequately, impartially enforce its different protocols, especially the protocols on security, on democracy, on free and fair elections. Countries should not be treated differently. Why? A regime that is deemed civilian, that captured the apparatus of the states to maintain itself in power, should be dealt with the same way a military regime takes over and perpetuates itself. I clearly understand we have had so many examples of military regimes in Africa that ended up not yielding or achieving the goals for which they took power. There are plenty of literature around that demonstrate that. The different military regimes that took over in Nigeria did not all produce the same results. Only one of them, probably, the regime of Abu Salami Abubakar, that took over at the death of Sani Abacha, that took 9 months to organize election and reset Nigeria on the path that we know today. It is still not perfect, but Nigeria, since 1999 now, every 4 years has gone to election to elect their leaders. We have seen in Benin, Mathieu Kérékou at the time accepted, under the pressure of the streets, to appoint a prime minister, Monseigneur de Souza, go through a period of transition, lose the election to Nicéphore Soglo, and then come back. So there's some examples, but there are also plenty of examples where the military can become actually dictators the same way civilians. So the ECOWAS needs to have the same and adequate and impartial level of treatment for all. Another thing will be security. If the ECOWAS is capable of building itself in a sovereign manner to protect and to help those countries, secure their borders and even their security within, it will be another major incentive. And I want to end on those terms in there, Sharon. I do not see that being impossible because we are dealing with human beings. Nothing is set in stone. Listen, the Berlin Wall fell in our lifetime. When we were little in elementary school, we heard about that wall, and all that we were taught about the world divide, the bipolar world. We did not know that, before the end of the 1990s, or by the 1990s, the Berlin Wall will fall, that Germany will reunite and become the strength that it is today in Europe. So we are dealing with human beings. Everything is possible.
Everything is possible indeed. Thank you immensely, Dr. Adi Eric, a global politics consultant and executive secretary of Committee for Actions of Côte d'Ivoire. Thank you immensely for sharing your insight in today's edition of Talking Point.
My pleasure, Sharon, always.
It's always a pleasure to be in your company, ladies and gentlemen. We believe you learned a lot from today's conversation. Meanwhile, on this note, that we shall be drawing down the curtains of today's edition of Talking Point over For You Media Africa. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and to have a beautiful day in company of our numerous programs. Bye-bye.